Smoke chokes the air first, thick and acrid, like the breath of some vast, dying beast. It coils around your throat, forcing coughs that rasp like dry leaves underfoot. Then the screams pierce through high, jagged wails that twist into silence, only to erupt again from another shadowed alley. You stumble over a body, warm still, its robes torn and stained dark. The ground trembles under the march of iron-shod boots, a rhythm that drowns the pleas. Flames lick the edges of marble columns, once proud sentinels of a harbor queen, now crumbling ghosts. A girl's hand clutches yours, her nails digging in, eyes wide with the kind of terror that forgets to blink. She whispers something in a tongue like rolling waves, but the words shatter as a shadow falls over you both soldiers, faces smeared with soot and victory, their blades catching the firelight. This is no battlefield's end. This is the heart of a city, ripped open. And in that moment, as the first hand reaches out, you realize the fall isn't in the stones, it's in the breaking of what comes after. What you're about to hear involves systematic enslavement and the implied violence of conquest against women and families. These events are drawn from ancient accounts and archaeological traces, but they remain deeply disturbing. If this pulls you too close to the edge, step away, I'll understand completely. For those who stay, we turn our gaze not to linger on the pain, but to uncover the gears of an empire that turned people into profit. Let's walk this path together, with care. Imagine a sea that mirrors the sky on clear days, vast and unyielding, cradling two powers locked in a grudge older than the salt in its waves. To the north, Rome, a republic of farmers turned warriors, their legions forged in the fires of endless border skirmishes, their senators dreaming of fields that stretch beyond the horizon. Across that water, Carthage, a phoenix city risen from Phoenician sails, her harbors choked with grain ships and spice galleys, her nobles draped in purple, dyed from the blood of sea snails. For over a century, these two had clashed in wars that scarred the Mediterranean like lightning veins, first over islands that bobbed like forgotten coins, then in a second storm where elephants thundered across Italian hills, leaving Roman dead in heaps that fed the crows. Peace came, but it was a chain, not a balm. Carthage stripped of her fleet, her sons barred from arms, her trade routes squeezed until the merchants whispered of suffocation. This wasn't chaos born of a single mad spark. This was accounting, cold and deliberate. Rome's elite, those patricians in togas stiff with ambition, saw Carthage not as a foe to forgive, but a ledger entry to erase. Her farms, fertile as Eden after the rains, tempted like forbidden fruit. Her position, a chokehold on trade winds that carried gold from the east. Senators like Cato, stubborn as oak, voice like gravel, ended every speech with the same hammer. Carthage must be destroyed, not out of hate alone, but calculation. Let her rebuild, and she'd rise again, sails billowing, coins clinking. Destroy her, and Rome claims the board. The stakes, dominion over a sea that fed empires. Then, a world where one city's shadow lengthens into night. Now, echoes in every border we draw, every resource we covet. This tale reframes the sack not as barbaric frenzy, but as the quiet efficiency of erasure, the machine of conquest, oiled by law and legion, grinding forward until nothing noble remains but ghosts. Long before the torches met the thatch, Publius Cornelius Scipio Aemilianus walked a path carved by bloodlines thicker than wine. Born in the shadow of triumphs, his natural father, Lucius Aemilius Paulus, had crushed Macedonian kings under boot and banner. His adoptive grandfather, the elder Scipio Africanus, had stared down Hannibal's elephants and lived to toast the victory. Young Scipio grew in a Rome where glory was both crown and curse. The city pulsed with the Second Punic War's scars. Widows' wails in the forums, veterans begging crusts from the hands that once cheered them. Scipio, barely a man at 17, stood on Pydnus Field in 168 BC, his father's shield-bearer, watching Greek phalanxes shatter like brittle bone. That dust-choked clash etched into him the thrill of the break, the moment when disciplined lines turned chaos into conquest. But Rome's machine didn't forge heroes in isolation. It demanded tribute from the young. Scipio volunteered for the African campaigns, his patrician blood a key to command. He sparred with philosophers in torchlit villas, quoting Homer over cups of Falernian, yet his nights twisted with visions of Cannae's slaughter, where his grandfather's kin had fallen to Hannibal's cunning. Trauma lingered like smoke, the fear that Rome, for all her iron, could crumble if mercy softened the edge. By his 30s, whispers called him the new Africanus, a title heavy as a gladius. He married Sempronia, a Gracchus cousin, binding houses like knots in a sailor's rope alliances that pulled him toward the Senate's intrigues, where old grudges against Carthage simmered like stew left too long on the fire. The turning point came not in thunder, but in the Senate's murmur. In 149 BC, envoys from Carthage arrived, olive branches in hand, swearing fealty after some border spat with Numidia, Rome's puppet king, itching for war. The senators feigned acceptance, then sprang the trap. Dismantle your walls, surrender your ships, scatter your people inland. Carthage balked, her council chambers echoing with defiance. Rome declared war, not as vengeance but policy. Delenda est Carthago, Cato's ghost in every vote. Scipio, then a tribune, watched the fleets sail, his jaw set like marble. He knew the machine's hunger. He'd oiled it in Spain, where Celtiberian tribes bent knee or broke. Now, Africa called again. And in that spring of embassies turned to iron, Scipio saw his moment, not to lead the charge, but to wield the hammer that would silence the anvil forever. The sun hung low over the Gulf of Tunis, that autumn of 149 BC, painting the waves in bruised purples and golds. Carthage sprawled like a jeweled claw against the shore, her double harbors a marvel of stone arms embracing the sea, warehouses bulging with ivory tusks and cedar from distant cedars, temples topped with bronze that caught the dying light like captured stars. The air hummed with salt spray and the faint rot of fish markets, mingled with incense from altars where priests murmured to Baal and Tanit. Women in saffron veils bartered silks at the harbor side, their laughter a counterpoint to the creak of galleys unloading amphorae of oil. Children darted through alleys paved with history, dodging carts heaped with figs as sweet as stolen kisses. This was no fortress of desperation, but a city alive merchants plotting routes to Hispania's silver mines, senators in council robes debating tribute tallies, families gathering under olive boughs for evening meals of garum and barley flatbread. In one such home, high on Byrsa Hill, where the citadel's shadow fell long, lived Thalassa, daughter of a council elder whose ledgers had once balanced Carthage's fleets against Rome's greed. At 23, she moved through her world with the grace of seafoam hair, like polished ebony bound in silver fillets, eyes the color of Libyan sands at dusk. Her days wove tapestries of routine, mornings in the loom house, threads dyed crimson from murex shells, singing stories of voyages her father commanded. Afternoons in the temple courtyard, offering barley to Tanit for safe returns of absent brothers. Thalassa dreamed of a match to a young captain, visions of shared decks under Syracusan stars. She laughed easily, her voice a melody that turned heads in the agora, and collected shells from the tide line, each one a whisper from Poseidon, she said, holding them to her ear like secrets. Her father doted, calling her his pearl beyond price. Her mother taught her the herbs that eased childbirth's grip, preparing for the day she'd swell with her own heirs. In that fading light, as the call to evening prayer rose from minarets like smoke signals, Thalassa stood on her balcony, tracing the horizon where sea met sky. Rome was a tale for old men, she thought, a distant thunder, not the storm itself. Word came at dawn, shattering the quiet like a dropped amphora. Roman sails clogged the Gulf 80 quinqueremes, their oars a forest of splintered spears, disgorging legions onto Utica's fields. The council chamber boiled, envoys dispatched with golden oaths, but Rome's consuls, Manius Manilius among them, turned deaf ears. Disarm, they demanded, voices flat as hammered bronze. Carthage's elders' balked walls were her veins, fleet her breath. Protests flew to the Senate like arrows loosed in vain. By winter's bite, the trap snapped. War declared, legions marching south, their supply lines snaking like pythons through Numidian sands. Thalassa heard the horns first from her rooftop, a low wail carried on the wind. Her father returned pale, scrolls clutched like talismans. "They come for our blood," he muttered, "but we'll give them iron." The city stirred forges lit in courtyards, women shearing locks to twist into catapult ropes, boys drilling with spears too heavy for their grips. Thalassa joined the weavers, her fingers flying over looms repurposed for sails, her heart a drumbeat against the coming tide. Tension coiled like a spring in the harbors, that spring of 148 BC. Roman probes nipped at the walls, catapults, hurling stones the size of oxen, splintering gates but not spirit. Inside, rations thinned to gruel and salted fish, yet songs rose from the streets, defiant choruses invoking Hannibal's shade. Thalassa's world narrowed. Her brother sailed with a makeshift flotilla, kissing her forehead with salt-crusted lips. Her betrothed fell in a skirmish at the Megara gate. His shield returned, splintered, a raven's gift. Grief hollowed her, but duty filled the void. She carried water to the ramparts, bandaged gashes from slingers' stones, whispered prayers over the wounded. One eve, as stars pricked the velvet sky, a runner burst into her home. The walls hold, but the sea starves us. Her father nodded grimly, maps spread like flayed skins. Rome sends a boy to lead them now, Scipio Aemilianus, grandson of their elephant slayer. Thalassa's pulse quickened. She'd heard tales in the Agora, a man of 37, stern as winter gales, who tamed Spain's tribes with blade and bargain. He arrived not as consul, but tribune, his legions drilling in the dust like ants devouring a fallen giant. Scipio's shadow lengthened with the days. He bypassed the stalled consuls, his voice in the camp a whip crack of reform rations halved for idlers. Scouts doubled on the dunes, a mole built across the Chthon harbor to choke supply. By summer, his name echoed in Carthaginian nightmares, the man who turned sieges into nooses. Thalassa felt it in the air's thickening dread, the way birds fled the gulf at his approach. One night, under a moon like a scythe, she climbed Byrsa with a lantern, joining women who sang laments for the lost. "He comes for our daughters," an elder murmured, "to break the line that birthed our kings." Thalassa clutched her shell necklace, its curves worn smooth by years of hoping. Refusal burned in her chest, not surrender, but survival. As Roman rams thudded against the seaward walls, she vowed silently. Carthage would not fade quietly. The demand hung unspoken. Yield your future, or lose it in flames. And in the heart of that besieged jewel, one young noble's resolve hardened like quenching steel. The breach came not with a roar, but a groan, the seawall yielding under Scipio's rams like bone under pressure. Dawn's light spilled blood red over the rubble, illuminating a tide of legionaries surging into the merchant quarter. Chaos bloomed, screams tangled with the clash of bronze, the air heavy with dust and the copper tang of fresh spilled life. Carthaginian irregulars merchants turned militia. Their tunics stiff with sweat met the invaders in narrow alleys, spears thrusting from shadowed doorways. Flames leaped from warehouse to warehouse, devouring bolts of Tyrian purple and amphorae of garum that burst like overripe fruit. Scipio, astride a gray stallion at the van, his face a mask of oiled calm, directed the flood with gestures sharp as daggers. "No quarter until the citadel," he barked, his voice cutting through the din. His men, veterans of Numantine hills, pressed forward methodically, house to house, street to street, dragging defenders into the light. Thalassa fled upward through the labyrinth of Byrsa, her sandals slapping against steps slick with rain and worse. The hill's acropolis loomed, a sanctuary of last resort, its temples to Eshmun and Tanit thronged with the desperate. She clutched a younger sister, barely 12, her whimpers muffled against Thalassa's chest. "Stay close," she urged, weaving past families hauling water jars as shields, elders with scrolls of genealogy clutched like weapons. The air vibrated with the siege's crescendo, ballistae twanging from the walls below, Roman horns blaring triumph. In the temple forecourt, Hasdrubal, the city's beleaguered commander, his beard streaked gray with siege dust, rallied the holdouts. "For the harbors that birthed us," he roared, his voice cracking like thunder. Thalassa's father stood among them, sword borrowed from a cousin, his ledgers abandoned for this final accounting. The confrontation crested at midday, when Scipio's maniples crested the final rise. Legionaries fanned out, their pila leveled, faces impassive under crested helms. Hasdrubal emerged from the temple shadows, suppliant branches in hand, olive and myrtle, symbols of parley long ignored. "Mercy for the innocent," he called, voice steady despite the tremor in his frame. Scipio dismounted, his cloak billowing like a raven's wing, eyes locking on the Carthaginian general. "The Senate decrees erasure," he replied, Words flat as a tax assessor's scroll. Your walls, your ships, your bloodlines yield or perish. Hasdrubal hesitated, glancing to the women clustered behind. Nobles in frayed silks, daughters like Thalassa, their faces pale masks of defiance. We built this from salt and sail, he countered. Take our trade, not our seed. Scipio's gaze swept the crowd, lingering on the young, perhaps 30,000 souls. Though numbers blurred in panic's haze, the noble daughters among them, a glittering vein in Carthage's fading ore. The air stilled, heavy with the unspoken. Resistance meant chains, worse than iron. Thalassa stepped forward then, her voice a clear note amid the murmur. We are no spoil, she said, chin lifted, shells glinting at her throat. Scipio's eyes met hers brief, assessing, like a merchant weighing flawed gems. Hasdrubal echoed her, branches trembling. Spare the women, the future. The Roman paused, the machine's gears grinding audible in the silence. Then, with a nod to his centurions, he turned away. The act unfolded not in spectacle, but shadow soldiers closing ranks, the first cries swallowed by the hill's folds. Thalassa felt the pull, a hand on her arm, then darkness folding over like a wave's crest. Word spread through the empire's veins like ink in water. In Rome's forums, couriers gasped tales of the breach, senators toasting with unmixed wine as if victory were vintage. But closer, in the camp's ringing Utica, whispers turned sour, tales of noble girls parceled like estate lots, families sundered for auction blocks in Delos or Ostia. This wasn't frenzy's lapse. It was the system's pulse enslavement as policy, turning daughters into dowries for the victor's coffers. Roman law framed it clean, captives as property, their labor, the war's dividend. Thalassa's kin scattered her father among the fallen. Her sister vanished into the throng of the bound. Scipio, overseeing the tally, marked the ledgers. Thousands of the elite, their silk stripped for resale, branded not with fire, but the invisible stamp of erasure. Historians sift the ash and agree. This machine outlived the man. It echoed in later conquests, where Gaul's tribes or Jerusalem's walls met the same calculus people reduced to pence, futures auctioned under the eagle's gaze. One parallel lingers, sharp as a pilum's tip. In our own ledgers of empire, where borders bleed and the displaced tally not in lives, but lines on a balance sheet. The suffering, a byproduct. The system, eternal. From the embers of that sixth day in April 146 BC, the lens shifts not to Scipio's tent, where maps unfurled like flayed hides, but to the eyes of Publius, the Greek hostage turned chronicler, who stood at the general's elbow as the citadel's gates groaned open. Publius, a man of 40-odd with a scholar's stoop and a soldier's ink-stained fingers, had crossed to Africa not as foe, but witness his history's a net to capture the Republic's rise. He watched from the ridge as Hasdrubal slunk from the flames, branches in hand, his once proud frame hunched like a whipped hound. The general's wife, clad in remnants of senatorial purple, two sons clinging to her skirts, emerged from the temple's maw, her gaze a blade across the divide. She did not beg. Instead, her voice carried clear over the crackle of burning beams, heaping scorn on her husband's cowardice. How fares the man who swore the sun would set on his city before his surrender? Hasdrubal averted his eyes, dust-caked and defeated. Polybius noted the hush that fell Romans frozen, their victory's roar stilled by this tableau of shattered dignity. The woman turned then, invoking gods with a finality that chilled the air, and vanished into the inferno with her boys, their cries a brief comet's tail before silence claimed them. Polybius turned to Scipio, expecting triumph's flush, but found the Roman's face ashen, tears carving tracks through siege grime. A day for glory, Scipio murmured, yet I dread the hour Rome meets this fate. The Greek scribbled it later, ink trembling, not hubris, but the machine's mirror, reflecting back its own devouring maw. Perspective pulls wider still, to the Numidian scouts who shadowed the legions from golden dunes. Masai, a rider of 20 seasons, his scars from border raids, a map of allegiances bought and bartered. Masai served Rome now, his king's treaty, a leash of silver denarii, but his heart tugged toward Carthage's spires, where Punic traders once swapped horses for salt. He rode the flanks that spring, dust devils swirling like omens, watching Scipio's incentives ripple through the ranks. Double pay for the swift, lashes for the laggard. The the promise of first pick from the spoils. The noble blood fetches triple, a centurion boasted around campfires, his voice slurred with looted wine. Masai saw the spread first-hand villages in the hinterlands, emptied before the walls even cracked. Families herded like goats to holding pens outside Utica. Whole clans vanished into the machine, elders to quarries in Sardinia, craftsmen to forges in Capua, the daughters. Masai turned his gaze to the horizon, where Libyan sands met sea. In one dawn patrol, he crested a rise, and beheld the horrors scale, not in numbers, cold as abacus beads, but human tides. Below, in a wadi-turned corral, thousands huddled under olive-branch shade, noble girls from senatorial houses, their veils torn, clustered like wilted blooms after storm. Guards paced, brands glowing in iron pots, the air sharp with fierce sweat, and the low hymn of mothers' laments. Masai dismounted, offering water from his skin to a cluster near the edge, a girl no older than his sister, her arms wrapped around, knees drawn tight. "They take us for weaving," she whispered, voice a threadbare veil over terror, but the eyes say otherwise. He pressed a date into her palm, its sweetness a cruel jest against the bile rising in his throat. That night, as stars wheeled indifferent overhead, Masai tallied the whispers. Incentives flowed upward, centurions skimming the fairest for private sale, Scipio's quaestors logging the rest as state windfall. The machinery hummed. Reports to Rome via pigeon and rider, auctions projected for the forum's slave blocks, where 30,000 souls give or take the fog of flight and fight would fund aqueducts and triumphs. A breather came unbidden, in the quiet of a tamarisk grove 2 days' ride east. Masai tethered his mount, the beast's flanks lathered from the press, and knelt by a spring fed from mountain snowmelt. The water ran clear, pooling in a basin carved by forgotten rains, its surface unbroken, save for a dragonfly's skim. He cupped his hands, drinking deep, the coolness a balm against the dust that coated his tongue like regret. Nearby, a thorn bush bloomed defiant pink petals unfurling amid barbs that snagged his cloak. In that stolen hush, away from the column's grind, Masai thought of his own daughters, safe in a tent village by the Mulucha River, their laughter a tether pulling him from the abyss. The contrast stung, beauty persisting, fragile as a bloom in bramble, while the machine marched on, indifferent to springs or songs. He rose, remounted, the moment's grace, a brief eclipse before the sun's harsh resume. Escalation fed on itself, the system's appetite whetted by the first blood. From Byrsa's heights, the purge radiated outward suburbs torched, necropolises desecrated, the air a pall of pyres that blotted moons. One stark vignette. A merchant's widow, her stall of spices reduced to ash, bartered her gold rings for a daughter's passage on a fishing skiff slipping the blockade. The girl, 16 and sharp-eyed, rode into the night, oars dipping silent as prayers, only to beach on a Roman-held shore where patrols waited like wolves at the fold. Masai heard the aftermath in camp mutters. The widow walked into the surf at dawn, waves claiming her as gently as a lover denied. But that wasn't the deepest cut. Scipio's error loomed larger, a crack in the armor of inevitability. In his zeal to seal the harbor, he overextended the mole engineers, straining against tides that mocked their plumb lines. Carthaginian sappers, fueled by desperation's fire, tunneled beneath, collapsing sections in cascades of mud and masonry. Legionaries drowned in the slurry, their screams muffled echoes of the hubris that birthed the war. Polybius chronicled it dryly. 2 cohorts lost, morale fraying like rope under strain. The general adapted, of course rerouting assaults to the landward walls, but the delay bought Carthage breath, her smiths hammering shields from temple bronze, her women loading scorpions with stones blessed by priests. The machine stuttered, just once, revealing the human gears beneath. A commander's doubt, a soldier's flinch, a city's unyielding spine. Time slowed to the crawl of an hourglass in that final push, the air viscous with heat and the reek of unburied dead. Scipio's legions, faces gaunt from the siege's grind, crested the Megara quarter under a sun that hammered like a god's forge. Below, the city sprawled in labyrinthine defiance alleys twisting like veins, rooftops fortified with barricades of uprooted palms and shattered urns. Carthaginian holdouts, a mosaic of nobles and slaves turned equal in extremis, rained death from above. boiling pitch that sizzled on shields, millstones tumbling to crush helms like eggshells. The sensory storm engulfed all shouts in Punic, laced with Latin curses, the wet thunk of arrows finding flesh, the acrid bite of smoke from braziers overturned in frenzy. Scipio, at the fore on foot now, his sword a extension of will, drove them upward, block by block, the hills slope a Sisyphean taunt. At the apex, where Byrsa's temples crowned the rock like a diadem of stone, the climax uncoiled in slow, deliberate horror. Hasdrubal's remnants, perhaps 5,000, ragged but resolute, barricaded the esplanade, their lines a thin red weave of desperation. Thalassa stood among the rearguard women, a javelin gripped white-knuckled, her shells scattered like forgotten talismans. The Roman wave broke against them, Pila whistling like vengeful spirits. Then the clash, gladii hacking at spears, shields locking in a wall of splintered oak. Blood slicked the marble flags, turning sacred ground profane. Scipio's voice cut through, a command for encirclement, no rout but containment, the machine's precision in play. Bodies piled in drifts, the air a miasma of iron and voided bowels. Yet the Carthaginians held, their cries a chorus to Tanit's unanswering stars. The act itself blurred into implications' veil, soldiers surging the breach, forms vanishing into temple shadows, the brief, muffled struggles that birthed widowhoods and orphans in an instant. Thalassa fought until a blow felled her world sideways, darkness claiming her amid the fray. When light returned, it was to chains and the hollow gaze of survivors. Her noble kin herded like chattel toward the harbor pens. Scipio surveyed the field, his triumph laced with the weight of Polybius's earlier words, the crack widening. Not in the dead, but the living heaped 30,000 daughters of the elite, their futures bartered before the ink dried on surrender scrolls. The breaking came not in steel's snap, but spirit's quiet fracture. Hasdrubal's flight in the dead of night, slipping deserters' ranks to Scipio's tent, branches trembling shattered the holdouts. His wife's pyre followed, a beacon that seared consciences on both sides. Thalassa, stirring in the pens, learned of it from a guard's jeer, the commander's betrayal, the flames that devoured his line. Rage hollowed her further, the system's reach laid bare, not conquest's blaze, but erasure's cold ledger. Scipio, weeping amid the ruins, as quoted by his Greek shadow, glimpsed the omen. Empires devour their makers. Yet the machine rolled on, unheeding, toward the auctioneer's call. Scipio's legions picked through the husk like scavengers at a feast, but the general curbed the worst limiting plunder to 1 week, lest greed, fracture, discipline. Hasdrubal lived, paraded in chains through Rome's triumph, a broken trophy fading into obscurity. The survivors, 50,000 in all, though the noble daughters numbered nearer 30,000 by the tallies marched to Delos's markets, their silks traded for tunics of coarse wool, families rent like parchment, Carthage's lands, sown not with salt but grain for Roman tithes, bloomed under provincial overseers, her ports refitted for legion supply. Power tilted inexorably. Rome's coffers swelled, her borders pushed to the Atlas Mountains, the Mediterranean a lake unchallenged. Long term, the irony bit deepest. Documents meant to exalt Scipio Polybius's scrolls, senatorial decrees became thorns in the Republic's side, fueling Gracchi reforms that chipped at the very elite who cheered the sack. Carthage reborn as Colonia Julia, a century later, housed emperors' villas on Byrsa's heights, her baths steaming where temples once smoked. The machine, in devouring its rival, birthed its own unraveling inequality's seeds, sprouting in the furrows of victory. Centuries slept under Tunisian sands, the Gulf's waves lapping indifferently at buried bones. Then, in 1830, a French consul's spade struck Punic gold ports unearthed like sunken galleys, their moles intact, warehouses amphorae shards whispering of trade long silenced. But the true unveiling came in 1921, when Jesuit scholar Paul Gauthier clambered into the Tophet, that precinct of stelae and urns where Carthage's grim rites to Tanit lay sealed. Over decades, teams sifted ash, 20,000 child bones, inscribed dedications pleading for favor, a ritual economy tying noble houses to divine dead. No direct echo of the sack's daughters, but the site's scale altars, worn by generations, painted the women's world in stark relief. A society where blood bought prosperity, now ground to dust by another's blade. By the 1970 seconds, UNESCO's gaze fell on Byrsa, French and Tunisian diggers peeling back Roman overlays to reveal the siege's scars, ballista bolts embedded in walls, mass graves pocked with pilum tips, the harbor's Cothon choked with collapsed revetments from Scipio's mole. A lone inscription surfaced in 1985, a Punic graffito on a temple block. Tanit save our seed. Scholars like Richard Miles pored over it in Tunis labs, cross-referencing Polybius's ink with carbon-dated char. The evidence coalesced, not myth, but machinery enslavement's toll etched in absence, the missing 30,000, a void in genealogies that once traced to Tyre's founders. Gautier, long dust, would have nodded. These finds humanize the ledgers, turning numbers into names unspoken. Why does this ghost rise now? Look to borders etched in sand and sea, where migrations clash with walls of wire and law. Modern parallels ground in the concrete, refugee auctions in hidden markets, daughters catalogued for labor or worse, empires tallying humans as assets in endless wars for resource veins. This teaches not moral thunder, but the anatomy of power, how resistance blooms in quiet vows, like Thalassa's unyielding gaze, how systems crack under their own weight, as Scipio's tears foretold. Human nature, resilient as Punic purple, staining the victor's hands long after the die sets. The universal truth, erasure never erases. It echoes, insistent, in every story we refuse to let die. Return to that smoke-choked dawn on Byrsa, where a girl's hand slipped from yours amid the crush. The flames have guttered, the screams faded to wind-whipped dunes. But the hill endures, its stones whispering of daughters who did not yield. Thalassa's kin, scattered to looms in Brutium or villas in Gaul, wove their threads into the Republic's fabric, children born with Punic curls, tales murmured in slave quarters that seeded revolts a generation hence. They were meant to vanish, bartered into oblivion's hold, but they didn't. Their blood pulses in North Africa's olive groves, in the salt of that same gulf where sails still tack. Inscriptions unearthed, scrolls unrolled, they persist, defiant as the Tophet stelae. And now they're here, with you, because you chose to listen through the haze. If this shadow lingers, drop a word below. What empire's machine haunts your corner of the world? Your voice keeps these echoes alive. In the end, history isn't the victor's trophy, it's the whisper that outlasts the roar.